Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. How are you all feeling this morning? Are you ready to discuss Africa? Are you ready to put our continent on the map? Are we ready to have the best event at the annual meetings? Yes? Yes! Because Africa can. Do you all have your badges? You're going to be receiving badges, and you're going to be reminding delegates here at the annual meetings that Africa can. All right, with that, ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you warmly to this morning's seminar on the state of the Africa region, and also where we're having a broader discussion on how to galvanize the necessary skills for a new world that we're talking about. Obviously, human capital has become a very topical issue at this year's annual meetings, and indeed, it was also very much a prominent issue at last year's meetings. And that's because the president of the World Bank and his deputies have decided that there is no ending poverty, there is no creating inclusive societies if you don't put people first. So today we're talking about people, our people, how to enhance their capabilities, how to improve their lifestyles, how to make our economies competitive, all mobilizing the robust talent that we have on the African continent. My name is Lerato Mbele. I'm with BBC World News, and I'm going to be hosting and moderating the discussions here this morning. We're going to be trying a different format, so support me, ladies and gentlemen. I need you to show me that we can. Obviously, when we invite our illustrious speakers onto stage for them to give us their perspectives, their country experiences, we don't want to belabor the issues. So we're going to do it in what I call a quick fire setup, a penalty shootout setup. I ask a question, I need an answer. I ask a question, we get an answer. In 5 minutes, we need to know what's the position from every speaker who's standing here before us. So at 5 minutes, you need to help me, applaud them, stop them. Let's get the thing moving. Also, I need you to make me look clever, sound clever. So if you can all pull out your smartphones, get onto Twitter, hashtag AfricaSOR, hashtag Africa State of the Region, and start having the conversation in real time on social media. I'll be able to see some of the questions that you're fielding, and then I'll be able to ask them, and then the World Bank will invite me again next year because they'll say she's really smart, but actually it will be your questions that you are bringing to the conversation. So please also make sure that you're using social media. Let's also say hello to all of those who are watching us from all over the world via the World Bank live stream. I've seen some of my colleagues from SABC and others. So hello, everybody, and the warmest welcome from Washington, D.C. this morning. Also make sure that you join this conversation via the hashtag AfricaSOR, also via the hashtag InvestInPeople, because it's about you. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, our host for this seminar, the Vice President for the Africa region, Makta Diop, to say a few words.
It's always a pleasure to be here with you. I mean, she makes us look good. We worked a lot with Lerato, and she's been a wonderful partner of us. We're talking about human capital development. We've been talking for the last 4 years about the commodity prices, how they evolved, how things are moving in one direction, how we need to cope with the shock that we have been facing. And today, and our president has been very clear about it, without increasing the productivity of our labor force in Africa, we will not be able to prepare our economy for tomorrow. It will be an economy of yesterday. And one of the things that we learned is that the structure of our economies in Africa hasn't fundamentally changed for the last 30 years. That's why we will not be able to converge as fast as we wish with the rest of the world in terms of productivity, in terms of gain, in terms of welfare, in terms of income for people. So what we're talking about today is why, when I was young in Senegal, the quality of education that I was receiving was maybe better than the one our children today are receiving, in spite of having the fact that a much larger number of kids today are going to school. This is a wonderful thing. But when we talk to our children today, we realize that they're not spelling the way we are spelling, they're not counting the way we are counting, and they were not having the same knowledge of basic curriculums that we had. We look at recently in 2014, and we notice that in grade 6 in West Africa, more than half of the children were 6th grader didn't have the right skills to pursue their studies. It was not the case in the past. So what can we do about it? And I think that's the discussion of today. But also, when these kids are learning something and they are able to get the information and get the knowledge that they need to know, do they have the right skill to be able to translate it in the workplace? And we have all the discussion about the socio-economic determinant of knowledge, how is the society, how the skills which are not the skills, the hard skills that you learn at school are important to be able to translate it in the workplace and translate it in the labor market. And when we talk about socio-economic skill, it's not something which is theoretical. It's about our culture. It's about our culture. It's about our national languages. It's about the way we're evolving the society. The socio-economic skills that we need to move in Kenya, in Ghana, or to be adapted in the economic reality of South Africa are different than the one you will need to be able to evolve in different type of countries. So it begs the question of what about our national languages when we talk about skill, education, and quality of education in our continent. We have a lot of our brothers and sisters, we didn't have an opportunity to go to school. Either they were dropped out or they just didn't have that opportunity. And we know that we need to do something about it. And you cannot necessarily want to teach them those skills in a language that they haven't learned since they were children. So we are opening a debate, which is a complex debate about how we can use our national languages to bring people, particularly in the early stage, to have the basic skill of literacy. That's one of the important questions. The second one is how we can ensure that the skills and the models that we had in terms of acquiring technical skills are the right one. We have a traditional model where a Ministry of Labor, a Ministry of Technology is there and delivering a curriculum. And we see that in reality is not as adapted as we want to the reality of what the companies and the private sector want to do. Are we ready to radically revisit that model, do things differently, put at the center of what we want to do the private sector, and ensure that as the one we are defining the demand and defining the way things will be happening, we are ready to do that. The third element is that education, what we learn, is not looking at primary education separately from secondary education, separately from higher education. In the past, you will see people coming from African university and be admitted and accepted in the top university in the world because our undergraduate program was so strong, the quality was such that it was competing with the rest of the world. Today, we know that it's a problem. So we have quality. So what we learned is that we couldn't talk about quality of primary education, vocational training, STEMs in our countries without looking at the entirety of the education system and ensure that we are at every step. And I think that today in the panel we have people being in academia, we have people from the private sector, we have ministers who are dealing with those issues and will be able to give us some insight. But the most important word is that we need to have our revolution in that area. Things cannot be as they used to be. We need to make a revolution which is a revolution of mind, a revolution which allows to build a new social contract in terms of knowledge sharing, of education, and empowering people to transform our economies. If we don't do that today, we will not be able to prepare our children and our country for the next generation of issues, to be ready to face to robotics, be ready to be integrated in the world economy, to take advantage of e-commerce, to leapfrog, and as we said many times, if we don't do that and if we don't invest today and make those choices, we will not be able to do that. It will require politics, and politics. Because at the end of the day, this is a political choice that country have to make. It's not a technical choice. There are some technical components that our specialists are providing us. But at the end of the day, the efficiency of service delivery, the absenteeism, the way we are articulating things is a matter of leadership, a matter of will. And I think that we have already good example on the continent. We can inspire us, and we would like to do that. I will conclude by saying, before Lerato come back on stage, to say that one of the actions that we would like to do is to start having a center of excellence on education policy in Africa. Today, I speak with a lot of colleagues and a lot of ministers, and they ask me, I would like to know about this experience in this country. And you realize that there is nowhere where Minister of Education can tap as information to be able to say, oh, I want to learn what's happening in Burkina, I want to learn what is happening in Rwanda, I want to learn what is happening in Kenya to see if I can apply it in my set of country. So this is something that we would like to do to ensure. Secondly, we will be pushing very much to give the resources to Ministry of Education to be able to have policy units so that they can themselves think about the trade-off, think about the policies, think about the future, and be able to contribute very actively to our discussion. So I will stop here, Rato, but I would just want to welcome everybody. I don't know, it's our number 6, 7, 8 state of the region, and I'm very glad to see that every year we have more participants, and I'm very glad to have this collaboration now, which allows us to reach an audience that we don't reach usually. And we will be just starting the debate today. We hope in the course of the year to receive much more information about what you think on education in Africa and Sidy. Thank you very much and welcome.
Well done. Thank you very much to you, Dr. Diop, and thank you for setting the tone of today's discussions. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me not belabor this. Let me introduce you to the very first of our conversationalists today. It's not yet the penalty shootout, so you can just calm down for now. We're going to be speaking to the chief economist of the World Bank, and he's going to be talking us through some of the research findings that really enhance the conversation. You all know, as the World Economic Forum says, that we're living in the so-called fourth industrial revolution. This is where industry is changing, manufacturing is changing, and the skills that labor needs are going to need to change. That means that as finance ministers, business leaders, you have to start imagining the future that is unknown. And you have to start equipping your citizens, your workforce, for this future that is unknown. And without those variables, how do we map it out? And I'm hoping in this conversation, we're going to find a way to understand how to make sense of the future unknown. Albert Zofak, please join us. He's the chief economist for the World Bank. He's the chief economist, right? Like he's the smartest guy in the room. Could you give him a bigger applause? Thanks so much for your time. Okay, so tell us about the work that you've been doing and what the research is telling us now.
Very good morning, Lerato, and good morning to all of you. The 16th edition of the Africa Pulse that we just completed is coming up with two encouraging messages. The first is that Africa is recovering. It's recovering, although at a very modest pace. And the second encouraging message is a number of African countries remain resilient. Now, on the first message, we're now projecting that economic growth for sub-Saharan Africa, GDP, would grow by 2.4%. Okay. This rate is probably not as high as we would have all hoped, but it's close to the double of what it was in 2016. Okay. 2016, at 1.3%, was the lowest for more than 2 decades in Africa. And looking forward, we expect sub-Saharan Africa to grow at around 3.2% in 2018 and 3.5% in 2019. Right. This recovery is powered by three important factors. One, capital inflows are back on the continent. In fact, we're seeing a regain in FDI, we're seeing a regain in sovereign bond issuance, and more importantly, we are seeing a narrowing down of sovereign bond spreads, right, which is signaling that there is a return in investors' confidence on the continent.
I want to interject.
Yes.
Where's the money going?
Well, interestingly, FDI is actually going into the traditional mining sectors, which is a problem. Now, the second important factor, I think, we are uncovering is that commodity prices that have actually driven down growth in 2016 are slightly recovering. They have stabilized at a lower level than in the past, but there is a slight uptick that is actually improving the conditions in our natural resource-led economies. And the third important factor that is driving the recovery is that our two giants, Nigeria and South Africa, who make more than 50% of our GDP, are out of the recession. They're still growing at only 1%. I'm not sure I should clap yet, but
as a South African, I think we need to clap.
Yes, we're out of recession. That's right. We're out of recession in Nigeria and South Africa. Nigeria has been in 15 months of consecutive months of recession. They're still growing at 1% for 2017, which is way below the potential, but it's already a good news. Now, the second important message, Lerato, is that, that low average, 2.4, is hiding a significant diversity, especially a geographical diversity across the sub-region. Countries in the CEMAC region who are essentially commodity-driven, especially oil-dependent, will continue to struggle, and growth prospects do not look very good. Now, countries in West Africa, in WIMO, are actually continuing their growth trajectory, powered by large and efficient investment in efficient public investment, especially in Côte d'Ivoire and Senegal. And we would see these countries continue to grow. These two countries grow at above 6%. On the Eastern Shore, growth is also on the right trend, where Ethiopia would remain the fastest growing economy in the sub-region. Tanzania, Rwanda are continuing to grow fast, and Kenya, of course, is also seeing a regaining growth. But why is all of this important, Lerato? And you are listening and you're saying, these economies always throw these numbers. But why is economic growth so important? It's because whether you are a student, a minister of finance, or anybody else on the street of our capital cities, if we can sustain economic growth, and especially if that growth is coming from a diversified base, the economy will create the jobs that we all need.
I think my question isn't, why is this important? My question is, what's new? What's new about these trends?
Excellent. Now, what is new? When we spoke last time in April, we had projected, a growth rate slightly above what we have now. So things are improving, but not as well as we have hoped they would be. But there are three things that are really new here. As I've mentioned earlier, we see a return in investor confidence, and that's something quite important. Okay. And this is stemming from a more favorable global environment, where we have seen higher global growth, higher trade, and also an easing of international financing conditions. Okay. Now, the second thing that is new is actually that fiscal space on the continent has tightened. In fact, our numbers show that 36 of our 48 economies have actually seen a tightening of their fiscal space over the past 3 years. This is serious, and this is serious because it's happening in a context of rising debt.
So for the benefit of our viewers on live stream, we are seeing a tightening of the fiscal space. Does that mean finance ministers are doing the right things now?
Well, a number of finance ministers here in the room would tell you these are tough times. These are tough times, and for countries that are commodity dependent, the need for fiscal adjustment is extremely serious, because as revenue go down, and our countries not already being able to mobilize enough domestic resources to face or to compensate for those declining revenues, yes, it's a very difficult situation. Now, it's important to highlight debt is actually rising extremely fast. Mm-hmm. Debt is rising extremely fast, and between 2009 and 2016, The average debt ratio, debt to GDP ratio for sub-Saharan Africa has increased by 15 percentage points.
Wow.
That is extremely worrisome. And it's worrisome even more because we have now reached a stage where sub-Saharan African economies have now surpassed the rest of the developing world that never got HIPIC. So our debt ratios are now above the rest of the developing world that never got debt relief. That's serious. And I know a number of Ministers of Finance may say, oh, my debt ratio is still below 50%. Why should I worry? But I think we should worry about this very, very steep rising trend.
Let me say something that might make me sound very, very leftist. But how do you respond to people who say, okay, having a high debt to GDP ratio might not be the most favorable position to be in, but if you're using that debt to do right things, if you're using it to build schools or hospitals, then it should be okay in the long run.
It should be okay, and as you said, Lerato, there is a big if that investment is used efficiently. If we are spending efficiently, then debt could definitely lead to higher growth rates. But the last edition, the 15th edition of the Pulse, has actually pointed to the fact that efficiency of investment hasn't been that high in a number of our countries. And more importantly, we have not always, invested the money we borrow. We have actually consumed part of it or most of it, and that's a problem.
I want to raise other trends that have come up, not necessarily in the research, but things that we're talking about. The Africa that we're imagining, the future that is unknown, is going to have many young people in it, already has many young people. What are we going to do about them, about creating opportunities for them, about empowering them?
Look, let me just step back and say, Africa has a huge demographic bulge. We all know 50% of our population is below 25. But sadly, Africa's workforce is one of the least skilled in the developing world. What does that mean? That means basically that despite increasing enrollment rate in primary and secondary school in our countries, we still have 1 out of 3 of our children who do not complete primary school. We still have less than 1 out of 2 kids who do not complete secondary school. And we have less than 10% of our population who complete tertiary education. That's not the kind of human capital that would take us to the next level. That's not the kind of human capital that would allow us, as our Vice President has suggested, to leapfrog. It's going to be very difficult if we do not do this. Now, what should we do?
Yeah.
What should we do? Our research is pointing to 4 important messages. 1, it is crucial for our countries to take a hard look at public expenditure in education and make sure we make it more efficient. In fact, what is happening is that Africa is spending more than any other region on education. We spend in average 15% of our revenues on education, and countries like Senegal probably spend 25% or 20%, around 20% of their budget on education. The average is 15% of our revenues. Close to 5% of Africa's GDP is spent on education, but the learning outcomes are not there. We are now entering what our recently launched World Development Report has called a learning crisis. We need to make sure our public expenditure in education focuses on what improves learning outcome. The second thing we need to do in our countries is to ensure that we invest in foundational skills. And what do we mean by foundational skills? We mean literacy skills. Our population needs to know how to read. We mean numerical skills. We need to know how to count. More people need to. it means also socio-emotional skills, which we do not always teach in our schools, but that are extremely important for adaptability and to, set goals and become more ambitious in creating your own job or managing it better. We need to make sure we invest in those skills for all our people. The third important thing countries can do from our research is to strike a right balance between skills for productivity and skills for inclusion. Skills for productivity would have to be cutting edge. And here we need to really push the teaching in science, in education, in mathematics, And I was quite struck when I visited the country recently to hear that the percentage of kids graduating from high school in math and science was less than 2%.
Wow.
That is a crisis. That is an issue we need to tackle, right? And I think it's even more important to ensure that we also, as we push for skills for productivity, include all age groups. The Vice President has mentioned adult literacy, local languages. We need to make sure all the age groups in our population are covered by this education. And last point, if you allow, as we start to invest in skills, it is important in our countries to ruthlessly focus on making skills provision demand-driven. It will not help our countries, especially in these conditions where fiscal space is tightening, to create thousands of skill development centers or vocational training centers that have nothing to do with the demand of the private sector. We need to involve the private sector into this equation.
Thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
Call to action, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, sir. Okay, so that's food for thought, what we ought to be doing, what we ought to be thinking about. Let's see if we can hear how to go about it, the building blocks, the tangible steps that can be taken from country perspectives and also from experts in the area of innovation and sciences. This is now where I really need you, ladies and gentlemen. I've got my buzzer. It's going on. When I press start, we're on the countdown to 5 minutes. Nobody's allowed to go over 5 minutes. Who's going to help me count? I'm relying on you, ladies. Put on your buzzers and let's do this. First up, Makta Diop. Let's see if you can handle it. So we decided that we're going to use the boss as a guinea pig. If he does really well, then it sets the bar high. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so the buzzer's on. We're going. You've got 5 minutes. I'm going to ask the questions, and you answer as quickly as you possibly can. And we go. So you gave us an overview of what needs to be happening to create the economy of the future. What can a development finance institution such as your own do to help?
What we can do is to first relentlessly invest in skills which are transferable, and STEM is essential. So we need to work with the country to change the curriculum and make it much more towards STEMs. We need to look at education in the whole spectrum of education, early childhood, higher education, and high school. Third, we need to look at people who didn't have the opportunity to go to school. If there is a big challenge in Africa, a large part of the existing labor force doesn't have the right skills. So these are the three elements. How to do it? We need to change totally the way we'll be doing things. We cannot consider that national languages is a side product, is central to education system, and we need to make sure that we see how to integrate it, particularly at the early stage of education. Secondly, we need to have programs which are very much targeted towards adult literacy. What I'm thinking about is the people who are working on the marketplace in Africa to be able to have programs that are targeting them at their place and teach them the basic skills. Third, in sectors which have low productivity like agriculture, to ensure that the extension program include also elements which are helping on human capital building.
We heard about overhauling economies. Do you think our colleagues here are thinking like that? You know, we're seeing oil-producing countries still looking at oil as the driver of an economy. We're looking at agricultural economies still investing a lot in agriculture as a driver of an economy. What's the big thinking that needs to happen?
People are thinking about it. I think that people are not static. Anytime I talk to a minister, I meet a lot of ministers in Africa, it's at the top of their minds. The question is how to accelerate the pace. So, as I say in French, we don't want to do, not at the stage of saying yaka. Yaka is you have to, okay? Is have to do it. And practically, the challenge is to make sure that the private sector, for the demand side, for instance, of skill, is integrated. So what we would like to do is to sit together and have very clear benchmark. Mm-hmm. And as long as we don't measure what we're doing, needs to have clear measure of the outcome in education and be accountable together on the outcome evolution. Secondly, we need to relentlessly involve the private sector in doing that. Third, the informal sector is not a residual. Mm-hmm. It's not say we're doing our system design stuff in the formal sector nicely, trying to Xerox copy what is happening in an OECD country and think that things will move. The informal sector is central to what we are doing in our countries, and we need to involve them and think about them when designing programs.
Yesterday, I was hosting the Human Capital Summit, and a few issues were raised. Education, obviously, was front and center, but they also spoke about healthcare. They spoke about gender empowerment. They spoke about nutrition. How do we incorporate all these issues into a very focused outcome for human skills development?
What we can do is already what we started is agriculture. Now when we are reviewing our programs in the Africa region, we would like for every program that we actually presented on agriculture to look at the nutrition component. One of the things which always struck me, CGIAR has so much research available and which just give you drought-resilient seeds. Everything is there. Why is not adopted by the farmer? So the question is to work on the how. That's what we'll be focusing on agriculture programs and to increase nutrition. Secondly, what we would like to do is to increase intra-Africa trade. What in reality is happening on that, you have often part of Africa which have an excess of production. We can help nourish well another part of Africa, but we created ourselves some non-tariff barrier, and we don't allow product to move. That's our responsibility, African. Nobody will do it for us. So this is a second thing that we would like to measure and to benchmark and to see and be accountable. And I think the best example I can give is what happened in East Africa community. When they decided that it was enough that a container which is landing in Mombasa and have to go to Kigali cost this price, the three of us head of state sat and relentlessly they went after the bureaucracy and say, this has to be removed, this has to be removed, and things changed. And they cut by half the cost of moving a container from Mombasa to Kigali without further investment. I just give another example. And I will finish 5 minutes.
You got 10 seconds.
10 seconds, okay. But I will give that example because it's important. We're talking about investing a lot about energy, about interconnectivity between countries. But what is happening, I asked some ministers, why don't you have more trade between countries? They say, because I don't trust my neighbor. Sometimes I buy electricity, I'm not paid on time, or I expect to receive electricity, and they don't deliver it on time. So what we are thinking about is, again, a collective responsibility, is to think about, for instance, in energy, about a supranational entity that will enforce contract between countries, and if a country doesn't want to pay, maybe just to cut on the other allocation to pay the countries their own money. And that's a collective responsibility. And this kind of things that I would like us to work together in a new contract to be able to move the efficiency of economy and continue investing in our kids.
Thank you, Dr. Diop. You're 40 seconds over your time, but thanks for your views.
Thank you.
All right, that's how it's going to work, but without the extra 40 seconds. Next victim, Sidy Ndao, please join me. He is an expert from the University of Nebraska. He's a professor in the Department of Engineering. He's been specializing in STEM education, and he's the founder of Sencol in his home country, Senegal. So he's the guy who's going to be talking to us about the future economies with science, maths, and technology at the center. Are you ready, sir?
Sure.
Okay, I'm trusting you to do it right, huh? In 5 minutes. 1, 2, 3, and firstly, tell me what you think about human skills development and what could be done tangibly.
Okay, I mean, reading about reports from the World Bank, we could clearly see that there seems to be a disconnect between the number of students who are enrolled in the school and the intended result that we had expected. So clearly there's a problem, and we are claiming that the problem is due to quality. And indeed, this quality in the education matters, but it's also due to fairness. I think it's important to realize that the quality of our education, as well as the success of the education system, is not oblivious to the socioeconomic reality of the countries. So I think it's very important that when we design education system, that it's not based entirely on reaching benchmark. Rather, we should have an education to wealth plan that takes into account all the interconnection of the different phases of development, for example, particularly job creation.
So we heard earlier on the chief economist saying to us that he was appalled traveling through the continent that less than 5%, he said 2%, but less than 5% of the graduates coming out of our schools are coming out with skills in science and mathematics. What could be done to improve that? Okay, so in terms of science and mathematics, what we need to do is to instill early on in the curriculum this whole culture of innovation, to make science and technology something that's very appealing, to make it very cool. Now, the way I like to say it is we need to make science, intellectual thinking, critical thinking more interesting, more cool than watching Neymar play ball or LeBron James shooting hoops. You know, it's something that... What's wrong with King James?
I think it's great. It's just that, you know, shooting hoops will not develop the continent. You know, it's great, but I think we need to have a mass, you know, number of science engineers who's going to be, you know, solving our societal needs or problems.
There was recently a report, a newspaper report, that in an African country, I won't mention which one, in the north of the country, they tested the school teachers last week. They wrote an exam that was meant for the students. They all failed. The teachers failed. You laugh, but it really speaks of the extent of the crisis. We're expecting our children to be brilliant, but who's going to harness them?
Right, so clearly this is far from being funny. Actually, it's a serious problem. It's a crime. And I think it goes back to what I said earlier, is that when we design our education system, we think about reaching benchmark rather than, you know, connecting the dots. And so the professor, the teacher who's not committed, you won't have teachers that are committed unless they feel that what they do will have an impact. And that means the student will have a job at the end of the day. If the students cannot believe that he or she can get a job at the end of the day, then clearly, you know, the whole system breaks down. I think there needs to be interconnection between all different pieces of our educational system, which is currently lacking.
We're talking about a future unknown, but we know that technology, automation, digital is going to be the center or the epicenter of how industry works. So what are the skills that are needed? What kind of people are needed now?
Okay, and this is true. You know, I think if we believe that selling natural resources will help us, we are really fooling ourselves. And we live in a country, in a world, in an economic world where, you know, skills are the primary driver of development. And in this particular case, STEM education is at the forefront of it. And so when it comes to whether it's, you know, having problem in drought, whether it's having non-fertile lands, innovation and technology find solution to those. So we need scientists and engineers who have, you know, expertise in all areas of science, going from, you know, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, civil engineering. But more importantly, on top of having those basic skills, we need to instill innovation within that.
I'm still belaboring the point. What kind of people do we need in the future? Do we need accountants? Do we need more lawyers? Are we going to need, you're saying we need more scientists and engineers. Right. Do we need coders? Who are the people who are taking us forward? Well, we need all of those, actually. But more importantly is we don't need them to have this breadth, this knowledge, this large knowledge or huge. What we need is experts. So the economy, the way it is right now, is increasing very fast. You know, technology is changing very fast, and what we need is people who are expert at particular fields, not being able to know everything. You know, in the past, perhaps it was good to know, you know, math, physics, engineering, but now we need people who are really good at coding, people who are really good at artificial intelligence, you know, people who are really good at, you know, automation, robotics, and then it falls into the whole, you know, vision of a country or specific, you know, needs of a particular country. Okay, we've got 1 minute left, you and I. The fact remains Africa's resource rich. And even if we're moving into a new future where there's technology, there's still oil, there's still minerals. We can't be saying to all these finance ministers, overhaul everything. They still need to leverage the resources on the ground. No, clearly, we're not asking people to, you know, not leave to forget it. It's just that innovation itself is an added value to your natural endowment. So if you have oil, if you have land, you need to to give it a value, you have to add innovation. Otherwise, it's stagnant.
People are growing, population is increasing, and the resource is not increasing. So if you do the math, it's not going to work. So in order to have sustainable development so that we could get out of this poor performing in economics, we need to have innovation, science and technology, put value to those natural resources.
So how do you create innovation centers? Do you just build an incubator? What do you do?
No, we could talk about that later, but it's a process. It starts from early on when the kids is at the elementary school and primary school to research labs and R&D labs in people who are in postgraduate.
Thank you very much.
Sure, no problem.
Okay, our next speaker is gorgeous, is smart, is articulate. She's the finance minister from Burkina Faso. Her name is Rosine Coulibaly. Please welcome her warmly, warmly, warmly. So, madame, you're going to have to forgive me. I wasn't paying attention in French class at school. So, here we go. Do I look cool? But hey ho. Okay, Minister, let's start with you. Tell us what you are doing in Burkina Faso to enhance human capital development.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I would like to thank the World Bank for mobilizing everyone on this day. It's a very important subject and topic. I'm not sure if I'm correct, but I think someone once said, if you think education is expensive, try ignorance. Those who tried ignorance saw that it doesn't pay off, that it is damaging to our countries. This is why in Burkina Faso, we've implemented 2 or 3 measures. First and foremost, we clearly stated that we will invest in education because education is a long-term investment. It is not something that is a social sector. It is a productive sector. It is a very important distinction. This is why human capital development is part of our priorities in our economic and social development plan. Number 2, what are the tools that we use to do so? We have 14 planning sectors. We noticed, as the Vice President mentioned, that the ministries are working on their own without talking to the others. You're looking at primary school, secondary school, vocational school, all of it separate from each other. So we now have a planning sector that works on education overall from start to finish. And this is a very important part of our work that I wanted to share with you. When it comes to the budget program, this is my role as Minister of Finance. When we allocate resources, we noticed in the past that resource allocation was based on the capacity of the ministers to defend their needs. But it is a matter of delivery, of budgeting based on results. If we allocate such resources, what are we looking for in terms of outcome? The Ministry of Education needs to implement measures. When they ask for money to train teachers, for instance, we realize that in some areas, there are not enough teachers in the classrooms. But in urban areas, sometimes you have 3 or 4 teachers per class. The Minister of Education was able to change these people back to rural areas.
How do you determine quality of education? How do you, when you're speaking to the Minister of Education, say, these are good outcomes that I will fund?
Chose intéressante.
Well, something interesting. We currently have an initiative underway between the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Education. It's the, I'm not even sure how to say this in French, it's the Delivery Council or something like this. In the work that they're doing, as I said, they are trying to show us that the use of their resources is as efficient as can be. It is interesting work because in our discussions we noticed that in the education sector, when we talk about discrimination, for example, in Burkina Faso and primary education, there are more girls than boys. The ratio is reversed because there's been a positive affirmative action, positive discrimination. But over time, the girls drop out because they think that they need to get married.
Que les filles n'ont pas la
Which means that all the girls go to secondary school or to higher education. And this is why in public policies, and this is an important aspect, we need to have educational policies that are focused on the poor, which don't create inequalities between boys and girls or injustices.
Us said it's very important to match the skills being produced for the economy on the ground. It's very important to have congruency. In a country like Burkina Faso, how do you say, this is the country we are, this is what we're hoping for, and this is the talent we need?
Dans le plan national de développement.
In our national plan of development, a number of objectives were set with expected outcomes by 2020. We are looking at the markets and we are looking at the profiles needed for the market. There's a dialogue between the private sector and the government. We have a constant forum between the two, and we can see what sectors create the most jobs. This is my role in my ministry. The Ministry of Education is encouraged to target training to these sectors. For example, when it comes to vocational training or technical training, we are a country that produces gold, but we do not have experts in this area. We noticed that we have sectors, for example, when it comes to agricultural processing, we're lacking engineers. This is why right now we have fellowships and other financial aid that is granted to individuals who want to study these sectors, which will make it possible, just like my colleague said, to not only train people who have general knowledge, but rather engineers that are specialized. But ask me another question you forgot to ask. Well, let's just reverse things. I'm not changing the rules here, but this is a very important question.
Nous avons des ingénieurs.
We have engineers and doctors more so outside than we do inside the continent. Brain drain is an important thing that we need to talk about, and that is the question that I would like to pose to you.
Because you're gorgeous.
I just wanted to say that these are important issues that are important to all of us. And as someone said, education is a whole. We have to look at it as a whole. The first 1,000 days for children, if we miss this in terms of nutrition, we miss development overall for this child and for his country.
Our final speaker is the Director General from the Arab Bank for Development in Africa, Economic Development in Africa. I just wanted to make sure I got that syntax right. Dr. Sidy, if you could welcome him warmly, please. How are you feeling? I'm generous, though, with my 5 minutes.
I expect to get more than 5 minutes.
Okay, let's go. 1, 2, 3, and human skills development, human capital development. What are you doing about it?
Yeah, one of our priorities is to assist our beneficiary countries in helping them. helping them to finance their project in the area of human capital development. Right. We are focusing with the beneficiary countries on 3 main areas. First, the access through providing necessary financing for building schools and vocational training centers and universities. Second, providing assistance for capacity building for trainers, training the trainers. And third, providing support for innovation. Right. And that's a new program we are just launching.
You know, sometimes I feel we throw this word around, innovation. It's very sexy, innovation, innovation. But what is actually being done to enhance innovation, not just by you, but by your colleagues as well?
No, we do believe that innovation, it's true that it's a very trendy word now, but in Africa, to develop the economic trend of business and all activities, we need to put a special emphasis on developing innovation. Innovation can take many shapes. Innovation can be in agriculture, for instance, because some countries are basically, their economy are based on agriculture. Some are on mining. But some also can try the ICT. And we see there and there in Africa, more and more countries interested in developing innovative ways of improving their capacities in ICT and related activities.
Another trendy concept at the moment is entrepreneurship. And many young people are being encouraged to be self-starters. Yeah. Find your own solutions. Who's backing them up? Who's giving them the money, the resources to be creative?
Badea is part of that. And at the end of this month, we are organizing with UNIDO a big conference for young entrepreneurship, African entrepreneurs, and also women entrepreneurs. And this event will take place in the Kingdom of Bahrain by the end of this month and early November. And basically, we are working with UNIDO to develop the capacities of young entrepreneurs and women entrepreneurs to take, instead of looking for a job, to be offering jobs for others.
We've spoken a lot about education, and nobody is saying it's not the critical intervention. But what else is needed? I mean, from the bank, financial inclusion. Is there a way in which we can target programs that truly empower women, the most innovative of our young scientists? Is there a way we can channel resources towards the best talent?
Yeah, definitely. Financial inclusion is one of our priorities, and some of the ministers here in the room know that we are working on establishing what we call the Poor's Bank, or Banks for Poors. And that's a new model. We are working with some of our partners, and particularly the Arab Gulf Fund for Development, to establish special banks targeting poor people and basically providing support to launch small businesses and some capital venture to help poor people to be financially included.
Right. So in the work that you're doing as DG of Badea, when you look into the future and you imagine it, what are you seeing? What do your eyes see?
We see we see shared prosperity in Africa. We see strong human capital development in Africa, and that needs the cooperation between, not only between development partner, but also government, civil society, private sector. So we should have a holistic approach to the development of Africa and the shared prosperity in Africa.
You are under 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Dr. Tar.
Thank you.
Please stay with us. So if you think all our panelists were rock stars, they did really well, they gave us their position papers in 5 or 5.5 minutes, and you're impressed, give us the applause. Now what I'd like to do is invite them all back onto stage, lady and gentlemen. And now we're going to take questions from the floor, and also all of you who've been having the conversation via Twitter using the hashtag AfricaSOR. So make sure that you are posing those questions, and then we can ask those questions. We will allocate about 15 to 20 minutes for this Q&A. So by a show of hands, who has something to say? Ah, Professor Ndao, hello. Just one? It's going to be like an auction. 2, 3, and all in the front rows. Okay, so if I can ask our panelists, please come back on stage and take the questions from the floor. And then I'll also be helped with the questions that are coming through via social media. Who needs the microphone? Okay. Here you go. I think you can share this between the two of you. Everybody else? I'm fine. I've been put at the end. It's okay.
Maybe
It's okay. No, have a seat. Have a seat in the middle, Mokhtar. Don't worry. Thank you. He's a gentleman, ladies and gentlemen. It's chivalry's not dead. Okay, so first question up here in front. Yes, sir. And may I just ask you to ask your question as short and as focused as possible, please.
Thank you very much. My question will go to Albert Zefak. I'm the Minister of Finance of Mali. Especially the first part of his presentation when he was talking about growth. Basically, he said that what we need to do is to fix the macroeconomics through the deficit, fiscal space, debt, and co, which we have been doing for some time. And actually, some of our countries in this room have been fixing so much their macroeconomics that they've been realizing growth that is becoming sustainable now, up for 10 years, growth close to 2-digit. But I'm very much troubled by that because at the same time, despite that sustainable growth that they have been experimenting for 10 years, poverty is not being reduced. We are not making progress on poverty. So I'm troubled by that because when you look at what we learn as economists at school, they said there is a negative elasticity between growth and poverty. Yeah. But what we are seeing in Africa is the opposite. You know, growth is going high, but poverty is following actually growth.
Fantastic.
So that's one. And I'm also troubled by even when you see other countries out of the continent, African continent, which have experienced that growth, they have been able to cut poverty by 50% because of having realized just 1% of growth rate for 5, 6, 7 years. Yeah. So what is happening in Africa? Why are we not being able to reduce poverty by fixing our economic and by realizing the rate of growth that we realize?
Okay. Great stuff. Question at the end of that row, Professor Ndao.
Thank you very much, Lorato. I'm the Executive Secretary of the African Capacity Building Foundation, and you will naturally understand that when you talk about skills, human capital, or capacity, that I will be excited, and I will want to make a comment. But the first is to congratulate the excellent interventions and the Vice President for really very thoughtful thing. It was one of my jobs to bring capacity development back at the center of development, and I'm very happy that this is happening. Two key things. And the minister mentioned that what the bank has done and has found out has really validated what we have also found out about the severe shortage of skills in what we call the critical skills needed to drive Agenda 2063 and SDGs. But there are two issues that I think are very important beyond leadership and change in mindset. Number one is the issue of the labor market, where the demand issues are quite more significant than the supply issues when it comes to jobs. In other words, and this is related to the issue of capacity retention, we are going to be scaling up the training of skilled people, but if the job market is not responsive enough, you will still have a serious problem of lack of capacity retention, which is a problem for many countries. So what we have tried to do is upfront, develop a strategy for capacity retention, capacity utilization, and talk about capacity circulation within the continent, which brings about the issue of capacity harmonization as well. So I would like to know if the bank is also thinking on how to really work together on this kind of issue. The second one is on the issue of making sure that African educational institutions training African young people to solve Africa's problems or to be more responsive to the economy that you see there. So what we have been proposing is a tripartite dialogue at the continental level, at the country level. And I'm happy that Burkina Faso is already doing that, to bring the private sector, the educational institutions, and the government to really discuss how education can more appropriately respond to the needs of the economy. So I hope that we can get the bank to work together on that with the African Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was a third question somewhere here in front. Here we go. And as the microphone is making its way to you, sir, I'll ask a question that's coming from the audience via social media. And it says, by 2050, Africa's population will have doubled. How can the continent address the rapid demographic rise and build skills at the same time? So numbers are rising, skills are needed. So somebody, if you can attend to that, please.
Merci. Je vais...
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll ask my question in French with your permission. I'd like to congratulate Mokhtar and the World Bank for this opportunity, for bringing us together on a yearly basis to gain from the insight, Albert's insight, and from the others. I'd like to congratulate the speakers also for their very relevant explanations and their opinions on the issue of human capital development, because it's really a very current issue. I would just like to share the experience that we have in Djibouti. As Minister of Finance, I think I know what human capital development is all about, and we're investing accordingly. About 24% of our budget is invested in this area. In fact, 24% of the budget is set aside for education. But it hasn't led to the desired outcomes. It hasn't allowed us to fully benefit from the economic growth in our respective countries. In Djibouti, over the past 10 years, we've had an average of 5% economic growth per year. 7% is forecast for next year. Having said that, of course, this growth has not produced the necessary jobs for our young people. Unemployment among young people is no longer a social issue or an economic issue. For us, we feel that unemployment is a security issue, especially when you have a very, very high unemployment. So what are the phenomena that we're observing? Well, over past decades, we've moved from an elite-based education system to a mass education system, and the quality of education has gone down as we've made the move. But it was a necessary thing to do, because we had to give the opportunity to everyone to get an education. Now, we feel this is a basic issue. What we're doing really is just producing future civil servants, and that's the overall strategy in all of our countries, and I think we have to review that. Can we really continue to train future civil servants? That's the real issue that we're dealing with at this juncture. Now, someone mentioned, I think, one of you mentioned the importance
of time.
I just finished with by saying this. We need to assess our competitive advantage on where are we going to educate our youth, the future of our countries, by assessing very seriously about the competitive advantage of the economy. You don't allow me to go furthermore.
I can't.
I just finished by saying this comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I think we're only going to have time for a second round of questions, and then we'll have to close it up. And I'm going to implore on you to please just make your questions focused and succinct. Okay, so let's go with the first question that was raised. We keep on seeing sustainable growth, which you refer to, Mr. Chief Economist, but we're not reducing poverty. Why? Why is that happening?
Thank you very much. Excellency Minister Cissé, that's actually an excellent question. Number of our countries have been growing above 6% for the past 10 years. But you are absolutely right. poverty has not been declining at the same pace. But just a slight, precision on your point. The elasticity is actually not positive. It's still negative, but it's the magnitude of that relationship that is smaller. What I mean is that growth is actually reducing poverty in Africa, but at a lower pace than it did in East Asia, for example. If you take a country like Tanzania, that has been growing at 7% per year, we have seen in our report on poverty that 7% per year is actually translating in less than 2% poverty reduction per year. So poverty is actually declining, but not as fast as we would like. Now, why is that? From our research, it's clear that it gets to do with the sources of growth. If you take East Asian countries that cut poverty, or that actually eliminated poverty in a generation, most of that growth was actually driven by highly, job creating sectors. Manufacturing drove growth, and a number of, public investment, public works program actually created jobs. The key to poverty reduction from all the analytical work we do is actually jobs. So the question, again, is how do we strive to continue diversifying our economies? And diversification is not just about leaving what we are doing. As Professor Ndao has said, it's about actually boosting productivity, including in the existing sectors. There is no single area today, including manufacturing, where technology and innovation would not allow productivity to increase, therefore creating more jobs. And if we do that, definitely we'll see a higher relationship between growth and poverty.
Okay, the next question was directed to the World Bank, but I'm also going to ask you, Dr. Ndao, to also provide an answer. It's this whole issue of what's being done to retain and improve capacity, because you're producing skills for a job market that's not responsive. So people are coming out of university, but they can't find jobs. What's being done to make sure that all the interventions are relevant for this Agenda 2063, the bank and Badea? So please, Makta and Dr. Ndao.
Yes, on the diaspora, I know that it's politically maybe incorrect. I'm less concerned of having a diaspora. It's good to have a diaspora. If you take a country like Ireland or the countries like that, they rely a lot on a very vibrant diaspora. The fact that India had a lot of IT specialists in the Silicon Valley is helping India, is not an obstacle. So I'm not as concerned. I'm more concerned about increasing the number of people who are qualified and responding to the need of the market in our countries. And I think that's why we don't have the right adequacy between the labor market and education. I think that as long as we will not be having the tough discussion, because now we're getting at the stage where we need to have the tough discussion. Teacher absenteeism, why it is happening in our countries, what can we do about it? Quality of teachers, what can we do about it? So I think that we're getting now to a stage where it's not anymore, I think, if we want to really make the dent that we want, to have the conversation, the global conversation, the macro conversation. And that requires, as I say, a discussion on the social contract in the society. How much we want to empower the household. Some countries, for instance, are double the salary of teachers. It didn't increase the quality of education. Some countries have taken other. No teacher, there is no teacher who doesn't want to be equipped to provide the right service to the kids. If someone enters the profession of being a teacher because he loves teaching, he loves the kids. So what is happening is that teachers are not giving the tools to do their job in a satisfactory manner and to get the satisfaction out of their work. And the public, the Minister of Finance are feeling that pressure that the cost is increasing every day. So I think that in all our countries, we need to have this open, transparent discussion about what are the determinants. And it will not be an easy conversation, because it's in a conversation which will need to require trade-off, which are made. Second, start getting out of the, moving a little bit from the thinking that if I fix things in Dakar, if I think things in Abidjan, if I think things in Nairobi, have solved the issue of the country. We have a large number of our people who haven't been able to go to school. And these people are risk takers, because when I sit in a plane and I travel with a trader who is traveling between New York and Dakar and buy goods to sell, that person is a risk taker. They know how to take risk. But it makes me very sad when I have to fill his form at the airport because he doesn't know how to fill a form and get to the country. Those are the questions that we have to address, and that will require that education system get out of the traditional classroom and go and sit under a tree in a marketplace and start teaching people the skills they need. These people know to do basic accounting in their head in our national languages, but they don't know how to write it, to have a contract, to build those skills. And as long as our public resources and our expenditure at the budget level doesn't take into account that needs, we will be keeping our. So there are some practical steps to be taken, some difficult conversation to have, and I don't think that we can postpone the conversation if you want to. Last thing is that it's clear that if we don't want to start to teach to a country like Rwanda is doing it, the first year of education, people are learning in Rwanda how to count, how to read, the basic things. And after they transition to English, and they speak better English than a lot of us, and they understand their language, and they touch other people. So how do we think about it? And it's not about making a huge revolution in the education system, but try to take the reality and look at the informal sector and adult as being at the center of it, and not as not forget them. Sorry.
Yeah. Dr. Tar, your submissions?
Yeah, I do believe that the issue of mismatch between the output of the education system and the needs of the market is a very big issue in Africa. But there are also two issues who need to be addressed in an efficient manner. One is the issue of trainers. You just mentioned the example of the test for some teachers who are not able to pass the test which would be given to the student. And I think there is a crisis in terms of trainers' availability. And the second issue is the issue of demography. Our population is increasing very fast. And the government, they don't have enough resources to provide full access for all newcomers to the education system. And in this situation, when you don't have enough resources to provide access to all kids, and you don't have the trainers, you cannot expect quality education. And the most governments have to make the choice of providing access to the larger number of kids instead of focusing on a small population and providing quality education. I think this is the main issue. The other issue also is the type of education, and particularly in the secondary and the tertiary levels. Most of governments go for easy solutions and provide education in humanities because they are less costly. And the needs of the market are basically in hard skills and in vocational training and even multi-skills, because people today can change jobs many times in their life. So they should be able to work in different positions and in different segments of the market. So I do believe that the approach can only be holistic, and it can not only be the responsibility of the government or the development partner, but families, civil society, private sector should work together to come up with innovative solutions.
All right. The third question, I saw that Minister Coulibaly was really interested in it, and also you, Professor Ndao. It was about the demographic shifts and the fact that we're seeing populations rising, and we're also needing these skills, and how can we manage the two processes? So may I ask the two of you to attempt that one?
Merci beaucoup. C'est une question importante qui est prise en.
Thanks very much. This is an issue that we're looking at that's not only being looked at in my country, in Burkina Faso. I'll tell you how we're dealing with this issue, but it's also being dealt with at a regional level because we, about 2 months ago, worked with other countries, CDAO countries, and during the meeting that we had, parliamentarians, MPs realized that this demographic issue should be dealt with in our policy development, because we realized that there was a disconnect between what we were doing in terms of improving, instead of creating wealth at the country level, between that and what the population was actually experiencing. So what people wanted were more and more teachers and police officers, etc. Now, in my country, there are 2 or 3 things which are very, very important, which need to focus on. We have to keep girls at school. If you keep them as long as possible in a school setting, there's more chance that they won't get married forcibly sometimes, and they'll have many, many children. If they're educated, well, they're able to negotiate with their partner, and this will reduce the birth rate, I think. That's very, very important. The second thing is that's very important is the services that are offered to our population. Currently, cesarean C-sections are free. Reproductive health services are also accessible free of charge. These are measures we've taken. The third thing that I think is also very, very important is sociological beliefs, the cultural belief system, if you like, because we think that God gives, that should also feed children. In reality, I think that to feed your children, you have to sweat a bit, really. You have to work hard. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done with the community leaders on this issue, with religious leaders. That's very important because it's anchored. It's really a part of the belief system. That'll take awareness campaigns, long-term investment.
I think the way I understand the question is the relation between the demography and the skills building which needs to be done. Is that right? Okay. So I think we have, as the population of the country increase, the problems gets bigger, and I think we have solution on how to solve them, but that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is what we do with what we currently have. As to my opinion, maybe we've had some mishap throughout this process of educating our youth, educating our population, and we've spent many years educating a large population, a huge population of the African continent, and it turns out that given this, and this is hard to say, but I believe it's the truth, given the state of the economy of the world, our population is either not educated enough, or it's not educated, or it's not adequately educated for the current economy of the world. This is the truth, okay? I hear, you hear NASA recently, or 6 years ago, decommissioned the space shuttle program, and this is a space shuttle that flies outer space, do a couple of things, come back, fine, everybody's fine on the spaceship. In our continent, we barely could create a toy airplane. So there is a clear problem here, and we're not going to magically change things, overnight. We have this population. We have these students, we have these young adults, we have these adults that are here, and they're not going to disappear overnight. These are real people. So the question is, what do we do with it? Before even we address the question of how do we catch up, what do we do with the current situation? We are not competitive enough at this stage. Okay, that's the truth. So the solution that could be one option is that we could. I think this is the time when we need to have governments of foreign entities who could come in and create a stimulus. And by that, what I mean is we could create industries that can have both roles. One, which is to help create jobs for the current situation we have, but at the same time help in developing a new strategy, a new education as well as innovation strategy for the future. A couple of industries that I could think of is one is education industry. Education industry, that means we create an industry whereby we create the workbooks, the textbooks, the content that we're teaching our kids, the technology that we use to teach our kids, we create them locally. These are industries that do not necessarily require sophisticated skills, and we do have enough people in the continent who could actually do it. At the same time, we are creating now this education industry that will serve the future youth. Okay, that's one. Another industry that I think could be very useful is in alloys and composite material fabrication. You know, we think about innovation and creating product development jobs. One of the pieces of that is to be able to have some base material, like, you know, stainless steel, brass, you know, bronze. So we, as governments, could help, you know, stimulate our economy by creating this industry. And the men and the women who will be working in this industry can be trained using our current, using the current population that we have. So this is one challenge I think we need to look into. And obviously, as far as what to do in the future, then we have to educate, and we just do it. We need to do it the right way this time. You know, not that we did it the wrong way. It's just that it wasn't good enough.
Right. Okay. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of the session time-wise. So what I'm going to do is, there was a gentleman right next to you, Daniela, who wanted to ask a question. May we allow him to ask the question? And may I ask for quick answers on this one? There is a question that came through via social media. Young people are complaining that there's a lack of jobs, and when they do have to work, they're doing petty jobs, but in fact they are a very well-educated bunch of young people. So that's also a problem. You educate them, but then you can't absorb them. And I think Dr. Ndao also raised that one.
That's actually an excellent question. And I think I should probably, you know, step back and say, earlier on in the presentation, I highlighted the need to find the right balance between skills for productivity and skills for inclusion. I think the other trade-off that is extremely important is the skills for today versus skills for tomorrow. When we're building skills, we cannot try to match one for one the demand with the supply of today. It is important to think, as Professor Ndao was saying, of future sectors that could emerge, or areas that are actually driving growth in other parts of the world, and make sure we don't just focus on providing the skills for the informal sector alone, which is, you know, the majority of our economies, but also invest in those cutting-edge skills for jobs of the future. I think that's important and links to the question of the youth in our countries having to do petty jobs, although they are educated. Yeah. On that, two points. One is we need to work with the youth in our countries to provide adaptability skills. But I think it's important that we realize we cannot continue lecturing African youth, because they are actually extremely industrious. They are all creating already their own jobs. Most of our states do not provide that much jobs for the youth. So it's important to, you know, create the environment for these youths to acquire adaptable skills that would allow them to increase their productivity.
I'm going to interject. And on that one is a question here that's come through, which says, young people are enterprising, they're entrepreneurs. What they need is an enabling environment for governments to make it easier to be an entrepreneur.
Yeah, let's be self-critical a little bit. And I think that there is a lot to improve on our side. I think that the general principles are there, but it's a very tough topic. And first of all, I think that we don't listen enough to the youth. We're talking to them, we are not listening to them. And in any of our countries, there are very few real settings where we have a frank, honest discussion, and where people are taking really what the youth is telling us and try to implement what they're telling us. So I think we need to improve in the dialogue with the youth in our country. Being our institution, being government, we are not listening enough to the youth in Africa, not listening nicely, but listening them to translate it in action. Secondly, the more I go and look at these issues, the more I think that being agile is important. And we are not in the setting in the way administration, government are set. This agility which is necessary to pick up the new trends is not there to be able to respond to the need of it. Let me take an example. The cinema industry in Nigeria. today is representing a huge source of employment and things. There is not a school of script writing in Africa, which is really serious about it. So we've been able to displace the Indian, the soap opera coming from Brazil, etc. There is a demand, there is a job creation activity, but the governments are not responding to the needs which allow to improve the quality, the productivity, being able to export, not only to have it on the market in Nigeria, in Senegal or things, but to export it to Europe, as they've been able to export their soap opera to us. So this agility, this ability to understand, to think on our feet, and I think it's something which is missing on our side, but also on government side, to be able to have Lastly, just be pragmatic and things. In Europe, for instance, there are a lot of jobs on craftsmanship, etc., which are not now, which need to be displaced out of Europe because they're too expensive to do that. But you take our goods, leather or whatever. You go to a typical African market. People are doing the finishing is very poor, and nobody will be able to export it. What are we doing in a small scale scheme to be able to trade? So I think that it's a lot of addition of this little thing beyond the more general issues of education systems that will be obviously taking time to improve, that we need to have, and we need to find a way to be much more dynamic and responsive to the evolution of the real world.
You want to add to that?
Oui, je voudrais effectivement réagir.
I would like to go back to two elements. First of all, when it comes to cinema, the vice president is absolutely right. Burkina Faso is the capital of cinema. We have a Pan-African cinema festival every 2 years. And we realize that we're spending money, but we're not getting money back. Soccer is working just fine that way, but cinema is not. So we've decided to encourage creation with a fund for artistic and cinema creation. When it comes to startups, we have a 2 billion CFA franc budget. That's about $4 million, is that right? $4 million a year that we put in place in order to encourage young people to come to us with innovative projects. You said that we're not able to absorb, but it's also their job to create. We need to put the resources at their disposal so that they can be as creative as can be. And we have a committee that has selected a number of projects that will be launched shortly.
Hi. I just had a question that I feel like sometimes it's overlooked when we talk about international development. And it is more, yes, it is more about the social environment in Africa. And the examples I'm going to give are just from Senegal because that's the country that I know intimately. And I was wondering, how do we change the culture where I think the biggest problem that we see is generally, for example, people always expect special treatment. Even if there's a government in place that does, for example, like applying for a passport, now there's a streamlined way of applying for a passport in Senegal, but everyone thinks that they have to actually go and try to find someone else who will do the legwork for them. And in a similar token, like people in the public and private sector, everyone have like a hard time finding a job, but once they find a job, I feel like there's no incentive to be very productive at that job. Everyone has a side gig, doing something else, and not really focusing on their job. I think entrepreneurship is very important, but you have to also make sure that you are doing your job very, very well. And I think the culture, the overall social culture, is encouraging that kind of behavior into, okay, we have pedestrian ways, but people cross in another, not in those, even though they are there. Yeah. So how do we change that narrative, and then how do we foster that? Because there's no country that has developed in a chaos. And on the other side also, I think also, it's just self-critical, I'm not being too harsh. But if we talk our culture without losing ourselves, having these celebrations on a weekday, 400 adults, full-bodied people missing a full day of work or 2 days of work to focus on that, even though it's culturally important, that is not what is going to help us develop. So how do we change that narrative, social narrative, so that all the international programs that are happening can actually work, and just lay the groundwork on that?
Are you saying we must stop going to parties?
No, I don't want to be a party pooper, but I just feel like there's a bit too much of it.
Okay, so the culture. And the final question that was also raised was from the minister from Djibouti. He raised a lot of things, but ultimately he was saying we need to assess our competitive advantages, and we need to stop creating civil servants. We need to be thinking outside the box. So if you could answer those two, please.
My view is that it's a time to, the diagnostic, there is convergence of the diagnostic. And I think that for me, the challenge is how to do it and to do it. And what I would like us to do together is to, first of all, measure what we're talking about, okay? So we'll be pushing to have an index which measures the quality of education, for instance, and understand why country X has a better quality of education than country Z. And so not, they are all living in a complicated world, they're all poor, but why is this country is doing much better than the other country? There is something inside there that needs to be learned of. So let's have relentlessly this benchmark and make ourselves accountable. And for me, there is no other solutions than making ourselves accountable inside the country, our own institution, and secondly, to listen to the people we're talking about. Let's stop talking to people and listen to them. And I think that is, for me, a takeaway.
And the final issue on competitive advantage, yes, sir?
I was going to answer the question on the services versus another approach. First, yeah, I totally agree that perhaps we need to get away from the service-based, not get away totally, but perhaps improve on the production-based approach in our continent. And I believe that one way to do that is by, innovation. And to give practical example, in order for us to be able to make use of innovation, something has to happen, which is research and development. And that's very important. And that is, African countries need to invest a lot on creating research and developmental labs on science and engineering. And the purpose of those research and developmental lab is to work on problems that are of interest to the continent, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in energy, whether in water and food. And the result out of those research should be taken from the lab to the market through product development, which will create viable businesses. And those viable businesses will create, obviously, more jobs. So we get away from the surface-based economy to some product-based economy.
Okay. We've come to the end of our session, but I'd like to ask you all one question. Can Africa do it? Can Africa do it?
Yes.
Africa can.
Will Africa do it?
Yes.
In this lifetime? Yes. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you to our panelists.